ask you to start this contemplation, which may give rise to the discussion. The correlation of the martyrdom of the apostles in the Apocrypha Acts, and we're now speaking about this. Well, surely this is something that can be immediately seen. It certainly deserved a lot of attention from the researchers. Much was discussed by Judith Perkins, Istvan Chashets, Anthony Hilborst, and others. But there are some things about it. Firstly, we need to highlight they were mostly interested in early texts, in early greater apocryphal acts of the 2nd and 3rd centuries, and they were mostly interested in early martyrdom, anything before the 4th century. Well, this is something that we'll be discussing, was something that was mentioned as passive history, but something that goes beyond it. The so-called minor acts. Minor acts, they are apocryphal texts beginning with the 4th century and later, as well as the texts, what Delens called passive. There's something they disregarded. Besides, their focus was often on the questions of ideology, theology, and sociology, whereas I would be more interested in the literary aspects, to which extent they are similar or dissimilar. In the meantime, this is a serious aspect as I see it, because the apocryphal acts, as I see them, the earlier are much revered, and the apostles were very much revered, as we heard about it, in early Christian communities everywhere. And their influence and impact on Christianity on art was pretty high. So before I move over to this comparison, I'd like to highlight the main starting or speaking point, some specific issues about the martyrdom in the apocryphal acts. Let me please begin with so-called major acts. There are 5 acts of Peter, Paul, Andrew, and Thomas. And as we know, John is not there. He dies a natural death. Although the original composition of the acts is still a debatable issue, but I stick to the conservative viewpoint, thinking that they were large texts where martyrdom accounted for the integral and was like a logical end of this long text. But pretty early, martyrdoms would become separated as their own genre in their own right, either when they were rewritten or when they were created or highlighted as a special entity in its own right. Well, for most part, these major acts, martyrdom looked like martyrdoms of the martyrs. There are main elements such as arrest and imprisonment, interrogation, sentence, then execution, then posthumous conclusion. No, it doesn't happen suddenly. No, it always is pretty logical. What is special about the martyrdoms in these major acts? Practically everywhere, what it all starts with is when people appeal to Christ or conversion to Christianity, somebody who is close to the ruler, rulers of all sorts of levels, maybe an emperor, maybe proconsul, or maybe a czar, a king. In the Acts of Thomas, they could be relatives, such as, for example, wife, like in the Andrew, maybe a lover of Agrippa, or like in Acts of Peter, they may be close family, or just distant family, but it has to be somebody who is close to the ruler, which provokes the anger of the ruler later on. What is also in common from these major acts are, we can highlight this, something that is typically seen both in passiones, but it's not necessarily always present. It's anger of people because of unjust execution of the apostles. It's present in every act, and besides, another specific trait, with the exception of Andrew, is posthumous appearance. He has to appear before somebody who is close or to the ruler, whosoever, and in this way, this concludes the text. And finally, we should point out that very much like if we compare, for example, martyrdom in early Christian times, we see great difference when we see martyrdom of Agapia and Perpetua, but the nature differs. The same is true of the acts. For example, in Paul, there is no imprisonment or interrogation. He's immediately arrested and sentenced to die, whereas the execution is discussed in every minor detail, whereas in Andrew, there is no sentence. It's missing. It just mentions, yes, here it is. He was there, sent to be crucified. No text of the sentence is there. Then let's go to the so-called minor acts. The situation is more difficult here. There are many more texts. I cannot enumerate them, but they can be immediately put into several groups. First are acts that are mimicking the major acts. And for example, in this sense, this is where Philip follows the traditional model. The second group are texts, they are the majority, where martyrdom is special. It doesn't end in Apostle's death, it ends in his triumph. He could not be, he really converted the people who live there. Classical is of Andrew and Matthew and Bartholomew. No matter, he was all then converted. And we'd also highlight another group among the minor acts where martyrdom is there from the beginning till the end. What is typical? They are full of miracles and wonders and fantastic and outlandish detail. But this is what we see in early Passiones. This is something we can't do without, but the number of these wonders, of these miracles, and in the major acts, they're also present. But the number of is still outlandish. For example, with the stone coffin of Matthew comes up, surfaces on the surface of the sea. Well, this is something quite outlandish, and not hardly to be imagined in early martyrdom. Another special point is that very often in these acts, it happens somewhere beyond the Roman Empire. Among the major acts, it's only seen in the Acts of Thomas, but a lot of exotic, fantastic, outlandish detail. For example, the apostle is martyred and is tortured by people with dogs' heads, for example. It's something that takes us beyond this Roman context, if you will. So I described these general characteristics of the major acts and minor acts, and now let's go over to, if we compare them to Passiones. What is it that we see? As I pointed out, what is typical of larger major acts, they still stick to this traditional sequence of events, although they may be interpreted in different ways, very much following the Passiones. This form, in many ways, is predetermined not so much by literary canon, but by legal process in Rome. First, a person had to be arrested, imprisoned, interrogated, and only then sentenced. This is what was dictated by life per se. But what makes it different, fundamentally different, is that the key role is played not so much by the act, not by the arrest, not the sentencing, not the interrogation, not the execution per se. What plays key importance is the sermon of the apostle. Sometimes they go beyond all possible imaginable dates. For example, Andrew stays on the cross for 4 days and keeps delivering sermons. Peter is doing it with his head down. It's difficult to imagine how this could be done, but still, if we look at what the Acts of Andrew say, what is it made up of? The thing is that the brothers come to the prison, and Andrey teaches them. Well, it is natural because martyrdom for the apocryphal acts is a law in its own, it's a sort of its end and its purpose. Since he will be dying soon, he's losing his physical life, he unravels the largest, the most sacred mysteries. And when Peter is hanged with his head down on the cross, he starts discussing how it all started. So this is the greatest mystery is undiscovered when the apostle comes to the end of his own life. Why? Because it was considered to be that the key idea in the major acts is the idea of a ghostly nature of all things that are material, all things that are earthly, that are down to earth, that are corporeal, unlike things that are spiritual. So all this interrogation becomes secondary, not so important. And it may be highlighted that the apostles could have avoided it, but they're still doing it to give them more better example. This is typical of Passiones. It can be done that, and special scenes when the apostle refuses to be taken off the cross.
He doesn't have his body anymore, and he is ready to be with his God. And he says that you should not take away from me this biggest happiness. These issues, these points that I named, they are seen from early acts. But what is the close things with the later texts? Daniel does not analyze in his book Martyrdoms. In Apocryphal acts, he says it's different, and this influence of martyrdoms is later. And this idea of miracle and extreme possibility and firmness, Apostle already has some extreme overhuman power, and Peter says that the prayers that martyrs turned to God, we do not see them in apocryphal acts, and I think this influenced Passion at it. On the other hand, if we consider the martyrdoms in small apocryphal acts that begin in the 4th century, we will see back influence. The Passionepic influences the form of these acts. There can be mutual influence because the texts are not really dated. We can compare the Matthew martyrs to Saint George situation where he is killed 3 times and he resurrects 3 times. And there are not so many such plots. We need to study them deeper and to categorize them deeper. So I would say that the general situation is as following. Passiones of the martyrs and apocryphal acts of apostles develop in parallel to each other. Passiones of martyrs are produced by local societies, local communities that preserve the memory about the martyrs. But the martyrdom of apostles was not created in a society where it was created. Andrew dies in Patra and Foma dies in India, and when uh, in Patra he was killed by proconsul, but real proconsul lived in Corinthia. He couldn't have had praetoria or residence. And we see that in these big acts, there is literature, there is imagination, no real facts, no real pictures, while for local societies that create passiones, it is important to depict the real picture. And in passiones, we see particular description of these martyrdoms, such as a ring that is put in blood. So there are particular evidences, and this literature freedom of apocryphal acts influences later, after legalization of Christianity, it influences what is called in passion épique. So martyrdom is separated from acts. Acts became absolutely independent texts. In Passion épique, we see kind of replicas of these texts, and they are richer if we talk about miracles. And what is interesting, and it is interesting that even everyday details are presented there. If we talk about martyrdom of Andrew, there is kind of an anecdote. It says that the brothers get together with the wife of proconsul Andrew prays, and proconsul all of a sudden has a stomach ache, and he asks for some vessel, and while he is sitting, all the brothers are leaving. It's quite a comical detail. And at the same time, in martyrdom of Anastasia, we see that like in Agapia martyrdom, it is said that Luikiti loved the Christian girl. He wanted her, but God changed his mind, and he was in the kitchen hugging the dirty pots, and he went up to his praetorium, sat on his throne, and started snoring. So there are these kind of comic elements that influence passions. I'm already wrapping up my presentation, talking about these small acts. More or less, they are born by the same and by the same circumstances. The purpose of passion is to create the memory. When we have a martyr or a saint person, we need to create a text that would celebrate it. And in certain cases, there are only small local cases. If we talk about who would create a local memory, how apostles preached to cannibals, they have a different purpose to demonstrate the power of apostles. And when we talk about St. Paul, there is a story how he went to the bottom of the sea to preach, and he started opening all the doors after it. So it is not about the local memory, but we can say that there is a joint, a united environment that creates these acts. And to conclude, I would love to say what I've already mentioned. These are kind of general thoughts that are not particular conclusions.